Thank you. Good morning. It's not surprising, I suppose, that my talk today is as much about some of the research I did at Caltech as about the social context in which I did it. In fact, it's heavily weighted towards the latter. I've never been able to draw sharply that distinction throughout my life. After all, I came to our discipline in open revolt against my lab director, who wanted me to use my scientific skills.
You don't have a PowerPoint?
No.
Right? Good.
To contribute to the development of the atomic bomb for the South African government. I refused, I emigrated, and I went to Britain, to the University of Sussex, where I studied the history and philosophy of science and did a PhD with Paul Feyerabend as my mentor, if not my supervisor. Feyerabend's book, Against Method, had just come out when I arrived. We weren't listening to Feyerabend along with 350 other people, discussing the wonders of the witchcraft and magic amongst the Azande. We spent our time in garrets at night, cutting and pasting by hand the proofs of a new journal called Radical Philosophy, now an institution in its own right, and also, on one occasion, protesting Samuel Huntington speaking on the campus about the importance of the strategic hamlets in Vietnam. This early trajectory of my life has left indelible traces in my own work, in which I've tried to situate science and technology in their social contexts, while always insisting that it is absolutely necessary not to understand the content and the practice of knowledge making. And that is clear from my latest book just come out, the edited collection with Chicago called How Knowledge Moves, Writing the Transnational History of Science and Technology, in which I insist that the object for historians of science who do transnational and technology who do transnational history should be knowledge, not one of the many other things that people do when they do transnational history. That being said, I'm delighted to have this opportunity to celebrate Jed's 70th birthday with so many good friends and colleagues. It is just 10 years since I spent 6 months in the Division of Humanities and Social Sciences here at Caltech as the Eleanor Searle visiting professor. I suspect it took something of a leap of the imagination and a willingness to bend the rules to allow me, with my Cold War focus, to count as a viable candidate for the distinguished position of an eminent medieval historian. But I'm certainly glad that Jed managed to pull it off. My sojourn at Caltech was and remains one of the highlights of my intellectual career, and I want to explain the deep impressions that I had while I was here. It is probably no coincidence that I arrived here just 2 years after Caltech had appointed Jean-Louis Chameau as president of the Institute, the same Jean-Louis Chameau who had been my provost at Georgia Tech before. I knew him in that capacity through his wife, Carol Carmichael, who'd taken my graduate class in the history of science and technology. And although we barely socialized with them in Atlanta, there was a bond there that we built on when we got here. Indeed, Jed and Diana invited us to a dinner at their home with Jean-Louis and Carol, and in the balmy, relaxed air of that evening on their beautiful terrace, we began to feel that we knew him quite well. When I came to Caltech, everyone was talking about Jean-Louis' olive oil project. He had enrolled the entire community in gathering olives from the trees on campus and extracting and bottling the oil. By the time I arrived, it was quite hard to get hold of a bottle, but I never really knew if that was because it was so expensive that nobody wanted to pay for it, or because it was so bad that nobody wanted to buy it. In all the same, my esteem for Chameau's capacity at community building remained with me then and still remains with me now. I mean, he's badly missed at an institution like Georgia Tech, where just in the last 6 months, we have fired 5 senior members of the administration for violating ethics conditions, including the lawyer who was supposed to ensure that people respected the ethics of the institution, as well as the basketball coach. Olive trees were just one aspect of the natural environment that I will never forget here. There were the orange trees. There were the beautiful green lawns that contrasted with the blazing white tents at commencement. There was the rock pool with the turtles. There was Roy Ritchie's rose garden. And there were the jacaranda trees that turned the streets of Pasadena into a carpet of purple flowers, reminiscent of the town that I grew up in South Africa. Of course, above all, there were the gardens at the Huntington Library, and the spectacular desert and Japanese gardens in particular. As an aside, I do think we tend to underestimate the importance of the environment, the geographical environment in which we do our work, and the uplifting effects that it has. I was at an advisory board meeting at Sciences Po in Paris recently, and you can imagine that everybody was talking about the gilets jaunes, the yellow vests, and trying to analyze the roots of their anger. And I was interested in some people who try to move beyond economic concerns and the lack of state services to talk about the conditions, the environmental and geographic conditions under which they lived, in which they spoke of la France moche, the ugly part of France. And perhaps it's not a surprise that some of the people in the United States who are most angry today live in some of the ugliest parts of America, where deindustrialization and environmental destruction is part of their everyday lives and something that they live with every morning when they wake up, in addition to their marginalization and poverty, making them, of course, easily vulnerable to opioids, false news, and political manipulation. I taught a couple of courses on the Manhattan Project and on superpower rivalry in space. They were oversubscribed, perhaps because of their intrinsic interest, perhaps because they provided a contemporary alternative to Ptolemy's Almagest and to Newton's optics. The best of my students were far better than any I had at Georgia Tech, of course. Though, to be fair, the majority were just about as good as our own majors, who, after all, are enrolled in the top engineering school. It was only at the end of the semester that I grasped what pressure these young people went through here when 2 people committed suicide in the very last week of term, one of them a brilliant young person whose parents arrived to find that he'd hung himself the day before. It was a tragic time for Jean-Loup, for us all, and it is spreading this suicidal tendency also to Georgia Tech's campus. I came to the division of HSS at a time when there was a particular need to build bridges with the Huntington Library. In fact, I was obliged, I didn't mind, to go there one day a week, and I had an office which was really just a hole in the wall, and I spent one day there speaking to everybody, which was a wonderful experience. There I spent my time working on the archives of Volta Bada. Volta Bada was a German astronomer who had come to the US in the 1930s and decided to stay on at Mount Wilson during the war, apologizing to his authorities for not going back to Germany to take charge of the new telescope at the Hamburg Observatory and to make a contribution to what he called the intellectual life of his folk. Bada interested me because he was the major promoter of the European Southern Observatory that eventually built a superb telescope in the Chilean Andes. His enthusiasm for this venture was driven by Bada's determination to advance the career of Otto Heckmann, his protege who took the job at Hamburg that Bada had refused in the late 1930s. And in fact, Heckmann eventually became the Director General of the European Southern Observatory. I learned a lot about Bada from the records here, most notably that he remained culturally and linguistically anchored in his German past. He was famous for his nostalgia dinner parties, where everyone, including his visitors from home, as it was called, spoke German. This was a loaded cultural statement, of course. Fritz Zwicky, a Swiss astronomer who also spent time at Caltech, reputedly called Bada a Nazi to his face, something that I've not been able to confirm even after speaking to people at the Zwicky Foundation in Switzerland. Heckmann, for his part, to be sure, engaged in the usual intellectual gymnastics during the war, at first distancing himself from Jewish physics and Einstein's theory of relativity, and then, after the war, claiming that, in fact, he'd always believed in Einstein's theories. He was just pointing out there were other classical interpretations possible. He was also watched over the pillaging of equipment from other observatories in Belgium, in the Netherlands, in the Crimea, and, of course, put them to the service of the German war effort. It was the Cold War, of course, that enabled men like Heckmann to be accepted back into the international scientific community so quickly after 1945. There was no boycott of German scientists as had been advocated after World War I. Their Nazi past was brushed under the carpet to secure their allegiance to the West in the face of the communist threat. Not everybody was so forgiving. Albert Einstein, who attended the first formal dinner at Caltech's Athenaeum in February 1931, was one of the few who spoke out against the German scientific community after the war, as you all know. Not because they had accommodated themselves to the Nazis during the war, but because they'd shown no remorse for doing so when the war was over. Nor did they have the moral courage to apologize for German war crimes. We would do well to maintain Einstein's sense of moral rectitude. Timothy Snyder is just one of many who sees strong parallels between Germany in the 30s and a resurgence of anti-Semitism, racism, and hate in many parts of Europe today. This surely imposes on us new responsibilities as historians of science and technology to tackle the perversion of democracy and of reason that is destroying or threatens to destroy our democracy. Intellectually, my time here was immensely productive. My interest in the Cold War dovetailed with work being done by Naomi Oreskes, who was the Bacon Fellow around that time. She organized a workshop whose proceedings we edited together and published in Jed's series with MIT Press under the title science and technology in the global Cold War. Equally important for me, and that might surprise Jed, equally important for me was that I was exposed to scholarly debates on the early modern period that I'd always been fascinated with, and with Jed and Motti, of course, but also with Christine Horgan, Gideon Manning, Nick Popper, and of course Noel Swedlow. I still remember the substance of some of those debates and laugh now at how angry Noel was with a young scholar who tried to contextualize an ancient philosopher's claim that the world was flat in order to prove that it was actually empirically plausible that the world was flat. Noel was incensed, and the poor chap crumbled under the onslaught. But of course, I deeply respect Noel's deep-rooted hostility to anthropological and sociological approaches to science that treated truth and falsehood as symmetrical, losing all sight of the importance that the world has in shaping our knowledge about it. We're living with the consequences of that today, as some of you know. Bruno Latour, who promoted that very actively, has had to recant and withdraw, recognizing that some of his relativist ideas are now being used very actively by climate science deniers in the United States. And he's had to completely refashion what he claimed when he originally made his proposals for what was just simply epistemological relativism. National politics was never far from our social interactions when I was at Caltech, especially in our weekly lunches with the philosophers. George Bush Jr. was the president then. I can still remember that we thought that the Dark Ages had descended upon us after he dragged America into the war on Iraq, irreversibly destabilizing the Middle East, not quite what he meant by mission accomplished, and then muddled his way through the disaster of Katrina, famously praising the disgraced FEMA director with the words, "Brownie, you're doing a heck of a job." We could never have imagined the state of the nation today, but perhaps we were just naive. 10 years ago, I designed a card for Jed's 60th birthday. It had a picture of Sir Isaac Newton on the left, facing a picture of Madeleine Albright, Bill Clinton's Secretary of State, on the right. An extract from one of her speeches sat side by side with the famous modest claim attributed to Newton. And this is what Albright said: "If we have to use force, it is because we are America. We are the indispensable nation. We stand tall and we see further than other countries into the future." This appeal to exceptionalism as justification enough to use force to shape the world order has been appropriated by the current president, who admires dictators, dismisses shithole countries, and tears up international agreements, and has also turned his anger inwards on people he dislikes, including Muslims, liberals, Mexicans, women, and the Democratic Party. Jed, I have no birthday card for you today. Instead, I can only thank you and the whole group at Caltech for inspiring me intellectually and politically, and for reassuring me that, in fact, a better world, and perhaps a more beautiful world, is possible. In the process, though, I've become like one of the cacti in Huntington Gardens, increasingly prickly as I adapt to a hostile environment in order to survive. Thank you.